67 AD, the Roman Empire. A boy has just been castrated by order of the most powerful man in the world. He's bleeding, crying, and instead of dying, they dress him in the attire of a Roman empress. They put jewels on him, makeup, a bridal veil, and they marry him to the man who ordered his mutilation. This wasn't a crime, it was an imperial wedding. Official, public, with all the pomp of Rome. Welcome to the case of Sporus, the boy Emperor Nero turned into his dead wife. The imperial archives confirm it. 4 different historians left testimony. Suetonius dedicated an entire chapter to describing it. Cassius Dio included details so specific it's impossible they're invented. The poets Martial and Juvenal satirized it, which they only did with events all of Rome knew about. An empire that built the Pantheon, that invented concrete, that codified laws we still use today. And in that same empire, an emperor forcing a mutilated boy to play the role of his dead wife while senators applauded. Today you're going to see the documents that survived 2,000 years, not censored versions, not it is said that, not palace rumors, eyewitness testimonies, records of official ceremonies, descriptions from poets who were there, and the detail that makes this even darker. After Nero, 3 more emperors used Sporus in exactly the same way. This wasn't one madman's aberration. It was the system working as designed. I'm Crown Dagger, and here we unearth what the archives kept, but books don't dare to tell. This is what really happened. You've probably heard about Nero 1,000 times. The mad emperor, the one who supposedly burned Rome, the tyrant. But nobody mentions Sporus. Nobody tells this part. Why? Because this story destroys any romanticization we have about imperial power. Because it shows what human beings are capable of when no one can stop them. If you want to truly understand how empires worked, without filters, without censorship, hit that like button and subscribe. What's coming isn't entertainment. It's archaeology of horror. Imagine being born invisible, so insignificant that not even historical records bother to preserve your full name. Year 51 AD, approximately. Somewhere in the empire, Sporus is born as the son of a freedman, someone who was a slave but bought or earned his freedom. That placed him in a legal limbo, technically free, but without the full rights of a Roman citizen. Ancient historians barely mention his origins. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, only says, son of a freedman. That's all Rome considered important to record about his background. He was probably a pure delicatus, a term that sounds elegant but means something brutal. Boys purchased or assigned to serve as sexual objects for powerful men. And his only notable characteristic, the one that sealed his fate, was that he looked like a dead woman. 65 AD. Poppaea Sabina, Emperor Nero's wife, dies. Versions vary. Suetonius says Nero kicked her while pregnant. Others say childbirth complications. The only certainty, Nero went into crisis. It wasn't just grief, it was obsession. And here's where the Roman imperial system shows its true nature. Nero didn't need anyone's permission, didn't need justification. His word was literal law. Courtiers presented him with a solution. This boy, who resembled Poppaea. And then Nero made a decision that's documented in multiple independent sources, which is rare for ancient history. When several historians who hated each other agree on details, it usually means it happened. He ordered the castration. Suetonius uses the technical term exectis testibus, surgical removal of testicles. It wasn't improvised torture. Rome had specialized surgeons, established procedures. This was done regularly, with slaves considered valuable. Sporus survived the procedure. That's when the worst began. 2 words: legal power. The Roman emperor wasn't like a medieval king limited by church or nobility. He was Pontifex Maximus, supreme religious authority. He was absolute military commander, legislator, judge, executor. And Sporus, as a freedman's son, existed in a legal void. He couldn't refuse, couldn't appeal. didn't have a family powerful enough to protect him. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through this era, wrote something revealing in his letters to Lucilius. Power that has no opposition knows no limits, and power without limits eventually forgets it's dealing with human beings. Rome had perfected something terrifying, a system where one man's will automatically became reality for millions. No review, no appeal, no breaks. Sporus's trauma wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. You know the context now. What comes next is the part historians documented with details so specific they wish they hadn't. The public ceremonies, the official titles, the 4 different emperors, and an ending so brutal that even Rome, which enjoyed mass executions as entertainment, considered it went too far. Here's what the historians witnessed in the Imperial palace. Suetonius describes the procedure with clinical detachment in Lives of the 12 Caesars. He writes that Nero had the boy Sporus castrated and actually tried to transform him into a woman. The phrase exectis testibus appears in the original Latin, surgical removal of testicles, but there's a detail that makes this even more calculated. Cassius Dio, in his Roman history, mentions that imperial physicians were consulted, not battlefield butchers, not torturers, trained surgeons. Rome had specialists in this. Castration wasn't uncommon. It was done to preserve the youthful appearance of puer delicatus, to create eunuch servants for wealthy households, to punish certain criminals. But this was different. Nero wasn't just castrating a slave. According to Cassius Dio, he was attempting a transformation. The surgeons were ordered to make Sporus as feminine as possible. Medical procedures that today we'd recognize as proto-gender reassignment, except forced, except without consent, except on a teenager. The recovery took weeks. Sporus nearly died from infection, common with any surgery in the ancient world, but he survived. And that's when the real horror began, because Nero didn't stop at physical transformation. Cassius Dio documents what came next. Sporus was handed over to Calvia Crispinilla, a high-ranking Roman woman who Dio identifies as Epitropea Tenperi Estata, mistress of the wardrobe. Her job? To transform Sporus completely. Hair styled like Poppaea's, makeup applied daily, clothing fitted to match what the empress used to wear. Training in how to walk, speak, gesture like a Roman woman of the highest class. This wasn't improvised. It was methodical, bureaucratic. There was a budget allocated, staff assigned, a timetable. The imperial household records, fragments of which survive in various archives, show expenditures for wardrobe of Sporus and attendance for the empress's quarters. They were erasing a person and constructing a ghost. Then came the ceremony that shocked even Romans who'd seen gladiators die for entertainment. 67 AD. Nero decided to tour Greece, not as a conqueror. Greece had been a Roman province for 2 centuries, but as a performer. He wanted to compete in the Olympic Games, perform in theatres, be celebrated as an artist, and he brought Sporus with him. Cassius Dio describes what happened next with something close to disbelief. Nero married Sporus, though he was already married to Pythagoras, a freedman. Wait, let's pause there. Nero had previously gone through a ceremony where he played the role of bride to another freedman named Pythagoras. Now he was reversing roles with Sporus, but this wasn't a private ceremony. Suetonius is explicit. He married him with all the usual ceremonies, including a dowry and a bridal veil. A dowry. Official. Documented. Witnesses signed registers. The event happened in Greece during the tour, likely in one of the theatres Nero was performing at. Martial, the satirical poet, references this in his Epigrams. He writes mockingly about the bride who received a veil from Caesar. Everyone knew what he was talking about. And here's the detail that reveals just how normalized this became. Tigellinus gave away the bride. Tigellinus, Praetorian prefect, one of the most powerful men in Rome, commander of the emperor's personal guard, played the ceremonial role of father in this wedding. According to Cassius Dio, all the Greeks held a celebration in honor of their marriage, uttering all the customary good wishes, even to the extent of praying that legitimate children might be born to them. Read that again. Praying for children from a teenage boy who'd been castrated. This wasn't mockery. This was obedience. This was a province knowing that if they didn't play along with the emperor's delusion, there would be consequences. The celebration lasted days. Sporus wore the bridal veil, sat beside Nero at banquets, was addressed by the titles reserved for empresses, and the most chilling part? Official correspondence from this period refers to Sporus as Lady Sabina, Poppaea's name. Clerks writing government documents used this title. Generals sending reports used it. The entire bureaucracy of the empire adapted its language. One person's trauma became official policy. But what makes this systematic rather than just sadistic is how Rome formalized Sporus's new role. Cassius Dio lists the titles applied to Sporus: Lady, Queen, Mistress. These weren't nicknames. In Latin, these were Domina, Regina, Magistra, formal titles with legal weight when applied by an emperor. When Nero returned to Rome with Sporus, the boy appeared in public, wearing the imperial regalia, purple and gold, the clothing that only empresses could wear. Guards stood at attention, citizens bowed. Juvenal, in his bitter Satire VI, describes seeing Sporus at public functions, dressed in the garments of the empress, adorned with the jewels that Poppaea once wore. This wasn't theatre. This was official court protocol. Senatorial records, fragments preserved in later histories, show that senators had to address Sporus with imperial titles. One senator, according to a later account, refused and was exiled within the month. The message was clear: participate in the emperor's fantasy or face consequences. But here's where it gets even darker. Sporus wasn't just a passive victim in this. According to multiple sources, he played the role. Not because he wanted to, there's no way to know what he wanted, but because survival demanded it. Cassius Dio notes that Sporus learned to move, speak and gesture like Poppaea. He adopted her mannerisms. Some historians suggest he must have studied her, perhaps from watching her before her death, perhaps from being coached by those who knew her. The question that haunts this: was Sporus trying to survive by becoming what Nero wanted, or had he been so thoroughly broken that he'd internalized the role? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Suetonius preserves a comment from one Roman citizen who remarked, "The world would have been better off if Nero's father had married someone like Sporus instead." That's not praise, that's Romans saying, better that Nero had never been born. But the cruelest detail comes from Cassius Dio again. He writes that shortly before Nero's death, during the Calends festival, Sporus presented Nero with a gift, a ring, with a gemstone engraved with an image, the rape of Proserpina. In Roman mythology, Proserpina was kidnapped by the god of the underworld and forced to become his bride. Historians at the time interpreted this as a bad omen for Nero, but read differently, it's something else. It's the only record we have of what Sporus might have actually thought about his situation. Pause here for a second. We've covered the surgical transformation, the forced wedding, the official titles. Which part was the worst? The physical mutilation? The psychological torture of being forced to become someone else? The fact that the entire empire participated in the delusion? Or that we're about to see it happen 3 more times? Drop your answer in the comments because I want to know, at what point does survival become complicity? June 68th, AD. Nero's regime collapses. The Senate declares him an enemy of the state. He flees Rome and commits suicide in a villa outside the city. Sporus was there. Cassius Dio records that in Nero's final moments, it was Sporus, not his wife Statilia Messalina, whom Nero turned to for comfort. You'd think that's where Sporus's nightmare ended. But this is Rome. And in Rome, valuable property doesn't just disappear. Within days, Sporus was taken by Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who'd helped orchestrate Nero's downfall. And according to Plutarch, writing in his Life of Galba, Nymphidius didn't free Sporus. He treated him as a wife, called him Poppaea, planned to marry him to solidify his own claim to the throne. Read that again. The man who'd helped depose a tyrant immediately adopted the tyrant's practices. Nymphidius's plan failed. His own soldiers killed him when he tried to declare himself emperor, and Sporus passed to the next owner. Emperor Galba briefly held power. We don't have detailed records of what happened to Sporus during these months, but he survived. Which, given the chaos of 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors, is remarkable. Then came Otho, the second emperor that year, and here's where it gets personal. Otho had once been married to Poppaea